You are fired, kid!
I own this company. I'm your boss.
"You're fired," he said. And here's the thing. He wasn't even angry. He was amused. Like this whole moment was some kind of sick entertainment he'd paid front row seats for. Christopher Hayes, the CEO, leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, gold watch catching the chandelier light just right, and he laughed again. That deep, careless kind of laugh that only comes from a man who's never, not once in his entire privileged life, believed that consequences were actually meant for him. Some people in the room laughed too, nervously, awkwardly, because that's what you do when the most powerful person in the building decides something's funny, right? But others, they just froze, and you could feel it, that shift in the air when people realize they're watching something that's about to go very, very wrong.
At the center of it all stood this woman in a plain Navy maid's uniform, no name badge, no fancy jewelry, nothing flashy, just stillness, the kind of stillness that makes you pay attention even when you don't want to. Her hands weren't shaking, and honestly, that mattered more than anyone knew at the time. Security was already hovering near the marble columns. Phones were up. You could hear the little electronic chirps as people scrambled to record, because let's be real, everyone knew this was about to become one of those moments that outlives the night. The event was supposed to be a celebration, record profits, charity gala, all smiles and champagne, and people pretending to care about causes they'd forget by morning. Instead, the CEO decided to make an example, to remind everyone who held the power, and he waved his hand like he was shooing away a fly. "Get her out," he said, taking another sip of his drink. Comfortable, untouchable, or so he thought. But then she moved, just one step forward, and here's where it gets interesting because she didn't rush, didn't beg, didn't cry like he probably expected. She reached into the inner pocket of her uniform, slow enough that security stiffened, fast enough that a smile faltered just a fraction, and she pulled out a folded document. Not dramatic, no big reveal, just paper, cream-colored, thick, the kind of legal thick that makes lawyers nervous. The room shifted. You could actually feel it. Chairs creaking, breaths catching, someone even dropped a fork, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. Hayes laughed again, but this time it came out wrong, short, defensive, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "Oh, this is rich," he said, shaking his head. "You think paperwork saves you?" She didn't answer. Not yet. She just laid the document flat on the table between them, smoothed it once, carefully, like it mattered, like it had weight beyond ink and signatures. And that's when the cameras really started zooming in, live stream numbers ticking upward on glowing screens, thousands turning to tens of thousands in seconds. That was the moment. The exact second when arrogance met preparation, when a joke stopped being funny, when a woman everyone had decided not to see became completely impossible to ignore. Yeah, the CEO was still smiling, but if you looked close enough, really close, you'd see it, the first crack in the armor, the beginning of the end. If you are watching this, here is me telling you that now is a good time to subscribe to the channel, because if you don't, this might be the last time you'll hear interesting stories from us. Do it now.
Okay, hold on. I need to just pause. Can we talk about this for a second? Because I remember, and this is going to sound weird, but stay with me. I remember being 14 years old, standing in my principal's office after I reported a teacher for, saying some really inappropriate stuff to students. And I had this folder, right? Just a cheap little folder from Walmart with printed emails and timestamps. And the way that teacher looked at me when I put it on the desk, it was the same look Hayes had right there. That exact same look of, oh no, this kid actually came prepared. And let me tell you something, that feeling when you're young and everyone's been treating you like you don't matter, and then suddenly they realize you've been 3 steps ahead the whole time? Chef's kiss. Nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to that. That's why this story hits different for me. Anyway, sorry, back to Bailey, because what happens next is even crazier.
The room went dead silent, like someone had hit pause on the entire world, and I'm telling you, You could feel every single eye swinging from Hayes's gold cufflinks to that simple sheet of paper held by a girl who looked like she barely reached the height of the chairs around her. Bailey Grant, 12 years old, standing there like she'd done this 1,000 times before, even though everyone had spent the last 30 minutes pretending she didn't exist. You know what's wild? How people underestimate kids, like really underestimate them. We just assume they'll stammer or break or cry under pressure, but Bailey had this way of looking at the room like she'd already run the numbers in her head, and everything added up exactly in her favor. The CEO leaned forward, lips curling into that smug grin he probably practiced in the mirror every morning, the one that usually melted board members and terrified assistants in equal measure. "Let me see that," he said, reaching out, and everyone knew he expected it to be nothing. Maybe a daycare permission slip or a cleaning schedule, something meaningless that he could laugh at and dismiss with a wave of his hand. But oh man, it wasn't meaningless, not even close. Bailey placed it on the polished mahogany table, and she didn't slam it down for dramatic effect. That would have been cheap, no. She gently smoothed it flat like she was telling him without words that she'd been planning this exact moment longer than he'd had that ridiculous expression on his face. The CEO picked it up, eyebrows raising, and the second his eyes hit the signature line, the grin faltered, just a fraction, barely noticeable unless you were really paying attention, but it was enough to send this little ripple through the audience like electricity crackling through water. "Where did you even? How?" He started fumbling because nothing in his carefully constructed world of strategy meetings and crisis managers and bribes had prepared him for this, not a single thing. Bailey didn't answer right away. She just folded her hands neatly in front of her, breathing controlled even though her heart was pounding like a drum in a silent hall. And there's something almost poetic about that. You know, that quiet, terrifying kind of poetry that says this isn't chaos, this is calculated. As the cameras rolled and phones flashed like tiny lighthouses in the dark, you could almost hear the collective thoughts circling the room like a whisper that grew louder with every second. She's going to do it. She's actually going to take him down. Because the document wasn't just a contract, it was leverage, it was justice wrapped in legal language. It was the invisible rope tightening around someone who'd spent years thinking he was completely untouchable. And let me tell you, watching arrogance meet inevitability in real time is delicious in a tense, heart-stopping kind of way. Watching someone realize just a split second too late that the rules they thought they invented don't apply here, not to her. Bailey's eyes met his, steady and unwavering, and you could almost hear the echo in the silence. "I own this moment, and yes, I know exactly what I'm doing." Subscribe before you miss what happens when he finally reads what's on that paper. And give this video a thumbs up if you're following. You could almost hear the air snap when the CEO's hand froze mid-flip over the contract, like time itself decided to hold its breath just to watch what happened next. This is the kind of moment that makes grown executives forget every line they've rehearsed for years, forget their training, forget the carefully scripted responses they practiced in front of mirrors, and trust me, I've seen rooms like this before, boardrooms packed with power and money and people who think they're untouchable, but nothing, absolutely nothing prepares you for watching a 12-year-old hold all the cards while a billionaire realizes he's been outplayed. Christopher Hayes had been the king of control his entire life. Every handshake calculated, every comment at these galas designed like theater to remind the world who was running things. And yet here he was, staring down at a piece of paper, realizing that all those hours spent polishing his ego and building his influence didn't hold a candle to actual legal precision. You could feel this subtle tremor of panic spreading through the room, those micro-expressions the cameras would never fully catch, but everyone in that space could smell like fear in the air, thick and unmistakable. The other executives were frozen. Some looked like they were about to faint, others like they were suddenly questioning every career choice that led them to this exact moment. And the board secretary, who is normally so meticulous and unflappable, actually dropped her pen, a small sound that should have been nothing, but in all that tension it rang out like a gunshot echoing through marble halls. Bailey didn't flinch, not a twitch, not even a blink. She just watched him with this calm precision like a conductor waiting for her orchestra to hit the crescendo, and oh man, it was coming. One of the board members finally whispered, barely audible but cutting through the silence like a knife, "That contract is binding, And that word, binding, it hung in the air thick and heavy like smoke you couldn't wave away. Hayes's mouth moved, trying to form some kind of retort, some witty comeback that would save face, but nothing came out, just this pathetic little stutter. Because here's the thing about arrogance, it rarely meets reality gracefully. It sputters and whines and panics like a child caught in a lie. Bailey allowed herself the smallest smile, almost imperceptible, not cruel or smug, but just satisfied, the kind of satisfaction that comes from spending months making sure this exact moment would exist. Every document notarized, every clause checked and double-checked, every potential loophole sealed tight as a drum. And watching a man who'd spent his entire lifetime assuming he was untouchable stumble like a kid on his first day of school, well, I'll admit there's a certain guilty pleasure in that, but it's not just revenge, it's something deeper. Something more poetic. It's justice served cold and calculated and utterly undeniable. The room was still tense, every eye flicking between the CEO and this girl who dared to claim power with nothing but paper and preparation. And somewhere in the back you could hear the subtle click of live stream cameras already counting thousands upon thousands of viewers holding their breath just like us, waiting for the next move. What happens next will leave you speechless. It was one of those moments that doesn't really make sense until you're actually in it, until you're standing in a room where centuries of power and influence and self-importance are quietly being dismantled by the smallest, calmest presence you've ever seen. Bailey Grant stood at the center holding that contract, and Hayes, Christopher Hayes, the man who'd built empires on intimidation and fear, looked like he'd just discovered the floor beneath him wasn't solid anymore. He tried to laugh again, weakly this time, nervously, and it wasn't that rich, carefree chuckle that had cut through the gala earlier. No, this was a stuttering, tight laugh like a violin string about to snap, and when he waved his hand, signaling someone, anyone, to intervene and make this nightmare go away, nobody moved. Security, usually so confident and ready to pounce, just hesitated, standing there awkwardly like they suddenly weren't sure whose orders to follow anymore, and the board members glanced at each other with this subtle panic spreading across their faces like wildfire you couldn't put out. Here's the thing though, and this is what people miss when they watch the clips later, Bailey wasn't just standing there holding a piece of paper, she was holding years of meticulous preparation, late nights with legal advisors going over every single clause, the kind of careful study most adults couldn't be bothered to do, and this sharp awareness that every heartbeat, every pause, every breath mattered in this moment. There's something deeply humanizing, even inspiring if I'm being honest, about watching someone so young take a room by storm without raising their voice even once. The CEO flipped the contract over again, scanning the fine print like maybe he'd missed something the first time, and suddenly his confidence just crumbled. Not all at once but slowly, painfully, and you could see the calculation going on behind his eyes, the desperate mental math of how could I have missed this? How did she outmaneuver me? The clauses were precise, the timing was perfect, the legal safeguards were airtight, and the cherry on top of this whole disaster for him was that it was happening in front of hundreds of eyes, cameras flashing like stars in that marble lobby, social proof on a massive scale with people watching and phones streaming, and everyone witnessing the slow dismantling of a man who genuinely thought he was untouchable. Bailey leaned in slightly, just a hair, not confrontational but precise, and she said it so soft but steady that it cut through all the noise. "Sir, you miscalculated, I'm protected, and the board will agree with me." I swear you could have heard a pin drop in that moment, like the whole world paused to absorb what she'd just said, and somewhere in that silence the first real threads of panic began weaving themselves into Hayes's face, twisting his features into something almost unrecognizable. That smirk he'd worn like armor all night?
Gone.
The scotch he'd been sipping so casually? Forgotten on the table. The audience that used to hang on his every word? Captivated by someone else entirely. And livestream numbers kept ticking higher by the second, climbing into numbers that would make any content creator jealous. Don't miss what happens when his empire starts collapsing. If you're the kind of person who roots for the underdog, who believes courage should beat corruption, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe now because we only tell stories where justice isn't just a fantasy, and honestly, people like you deserve to see how this ends. And then, oh man, then it started. That subtle shift you feel right before a storm breaks, the kind of shift where people in a room realize the rules they've been playing by their whole lives suddenly don't apply anymore. Christopher Hayes, CEO extraordinaire, billionaire in his own mind, the man who'd spent decades making sure no one ever questioned him about anything, was suddenly uncertain, hesitant, vulnerable in a way that made everyone lean forward because there's nothing more gripping than watching the mighty stumble for the first time. He adjusted his cufflinks, trying desperately to keep that posture of power he'd worn like a second skin, but the way his hand shook just a fraction betrayed him. Not much, but enough. Just enough that a few board members leaned even closer in their chairs, eyes flicking from him to the contract and back again like they were watching a tennis match, trying to calculate in real time how this had gone so catastrophically wrong. And there was Bailey, calm as a morning sunrise, eyes steady and focused, heart probably racing inside her chest like a marathon runner's, but her composure on the outside? Absolutely impeccable. The contract wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. You have to understand that. It was the culmination of months of research and planning and, yes, a fair bit of quiet late-night stubbornness, the kind where you refuse to give up even when everything seems impossible. Every clause had been double-checked, triple-checked probably. Every legal safeguard put in place with the precision of a watchmaker, and now in this marbled chandeliered ballroom with hundreds of eyes watching, all of it was alive, breathing, powerful. Security shifted nervously near the columns, genuinely unsure if they should step in or stay back. Phones kept buzzing with notifications, cameras clicked in rapid succession, and livestream numbers spiked in a way that would make any viral moment jealous. A testament to the electric tension that had gripped everyone in that space. There's something primal about watching power get questioned. Isn't there something that makes you lean in without even realizing you're doing it because part of you, maybe the part that's been pushed around or underestimated or told to stay quiet, wants to see the invincible stumble just once. And stumble he did. Hayes coughed, clearing his throat in this nervous way that didn't match his normally composed persona at all. It was like watching a mask crack in slow motion, and he attempted another laugh, but it came out thin and strained, and the room actually flinched at the sound. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath in unison, and somewhere in the back you could almost hear someone's soft whisper saying what we were all thinking, this isn't just humiliation, this is a reckoning. Bailey's lips curved just slightly, almost imperceptibly, not cruelly or smugly, but with this quiet assurance that carried more weight than any of Hayes's ostentatious gestures ever could. She wasn't just standing her ground anymore. She was building a quiet storm, brick by brick, moment by moment. Only subscribers will see what happens when the storm finally hits. And just like that, the room changed, really changed, like someone flipped a switch and suddenly everything that had been polished and perfect turned into something raw and electric. One moment, it was this perfectly orchestrated gala with crystal glasses clinking and waiters balancing trays with the precision of Olympic gymnasts, soft classical music weaving between polite laughter and fake smiles, and the next moment, it was a battlefield of nerves where everyone knew something massive was unfolding. Every eye was on Bailey Grant, and believe me, there's something almost cinematic about watching a 12-year-old control a room full of adults without raising her voice, without making a scene, just existing with this quiet power that demands attention. Hayes was fidgeting now, actually fidgeting like a kid caught cheating on a test, adjusting the cuff of his expensive suit over and over, tapping his polished shoes against the marble floor in this rhythm that betrayed him more than any words could. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and reclaim some shred of authority, but the words came out wrong, too fast and too clipped, stumbling over each other like they were running away from the truth. The confidence he'd carried like armor all evening was cracking, just slightly but enough. And here's the thing about hubris, it doesn't need to be destroyed all at once, just a crack here, a subtle shift there, and suddenly everyone in the room can smell it like blood in the water. Bailey stood perfectly still, calm as a frozen lake in winter, her hands resting lightly on the contract with her fingers tracing the edges as if she was drawing invisible lines of power across that table. There's something humanizing about seeing someone so young take control not through yelling or theatrics, but through sheer presence, the kind of quiet authority that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn. People underestimate that. I know I have, we all have at some point, but watching it unfold in real time makes you realize how powerful silence can be when it's backed by preparation. Phones flashed like fireworks. Cameras zoomed in so close you could probably count the threads in Bailey's uniform. Live stream numbers ticked into the tens of thousands and kept climbing by the second because, let's face it, there's nothing more compelling than watching someone dismantle arrogance live, and in high definition. You could feel the moral weight settling over the room like a heavy blanket. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs with this mixture of awe and fear flickering across their faces like candlelight, and somewhere in the back a security guard muttered under his breath just loud enough to hear, "She's not bluffing, is she?" And she wasn't, because the contract sitting on that table was airtight, every clause verified, every signature notarized, every word chosen with the kind of care that lawyers dream about. Hayes didn't just realize he'd underestimated her in that moment. He realized slowly and torturously that he had no one to blame but himself for this disaster. Subscribe now or miss the moment everything explodes. You know that feeling when the air in a room gets so thick you're basically breathing through honey, like every breath takes effort and your chest feels tight? That's exactly what happened the second Christopher Hayes realized the cameras weren't just recording for some private archive. They were broadcasting, streaming live to thousands of people who were watching this entire catastrophe unfold in real time. Phones were everywhere, held at every possible angle, live stream numbers ticking upward like a scoreboard nobody could stop. And suddenly what was meant to be Hayes's private demonstration of power, his moment to put someone in their place, was now the most public spectacle of his entire career. And let me tell you, watching someone with that much pride begin to unravel in front of thousands, maybe millions of eyes, it's something that sticks with you. The kind of moment you can't unsee no matter how hard you try. Hayes's laughter, that same confident chuckle that had started the whole evening off with such arrogance, faltered mid-sip of a scotch. There was this nervous catch in his throat like he'd swallowed something sharp. And the thing about arrogance is it never ages well when it's exposed to daylight. Not even a little bit. He tried to wave it off, tried to shake the discomfort like it was just a fly buzzing near his shoulder, but the room didn't believe him anymore. Nobody did. You could see it in their faces. Bailey was unshakable though, standing there like she'd planted roots in that marble floor, and she didn't shout or glare or make any grand gestures. She just let the evidence speak for itself, letting that contract lie flat on the polished table as though gravity itself had aligned with her sense of justice. There's something almost cinematic about calm in the face of chaos. You know, it's disarming in the best way possible. It's magnetic. And in that moment, everyone was leaning in with their eyes locked and their phones recording, waiting for the inevitable fallout that was building like pressure in a volcano. Security shuffled around awkwardly, genuinely unsure whether to intervene or just pretend this was all part of some elaborate show, while phones continued to flash and people whispered things like, "Is this really happening?" and, "Oh my God, she actually has him cornered." And yes, they were right. Bailey had him completely cornered. Every clause of that document was like a chess move forcing the king into checkmate. Every notarized signature was another door slamming shut on his options. Hayes's face betrayed everything he was feeling, that flush creeping up his neck like spilled wine, lips pressed so tight they'd turned white, hands fidgeting with cufflinks and glassware in this desperate dance of someone who knows they're losing control. The room held its breath in unison, everyone sensing the massive shift happening right in front of them. The humiliation was no longer private or containable. It was viral, spreading across the internet faster than he could possibly stop it. What happens next will shock you to your core. If you're the kind of person who roots for the underdog, who believes courage should beat corruption, then you're exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe now because we only tell stories where justice isn't just a fantasy, and honestly, people like you deserve to see how this ends.
So here's the thing about rich people that I've learned from covering stories like this for, 3 years now? They always forget about phones. Like, it's almost comedic at this point. I actually started keeping a tally. No joke, I have a whole spreadsheet. And in the last 18 months, I've covered 27 different stories where someone powerful got caught doing something awful. And you know how many of them forgot they were being recorded? 24. 24 out of 27. It's like, It's like they think money makes them invisible or something. Watching Hayes's face the exact moment he sees all those phones pointed at him, knowing millions are watching, that's what we call in the industry chef's kiss television. Okay, I'm being unprofessional, but come on, you saw his face too. Alright, let me get back to the story before I lose it completely.
And then it hit him, really hit him, like a punch to the gut that knocks all the air out of your lungs and leaves you gasping. Christopher Hayes felt it in a way that words can barely capture, that sudden stomach-churning awareness that every single eye in that room was witnessing his complete and total unraveling. And I mean, it's one thing to know you've made a mistake in private where you can fix it quietly, but it's something else entirely to feel the slow burn of humiliation spread like wildfire across a crowd of people who used to respect you. The murmurs started small at first, just a quiet shuffle here and a stifled gasp there, but it grew and grew until it became this wave of disbelief washing over everyone. Board members leaned forward with their phones held at awkward angles, streaming live to audiences that were climbing into the tens of thousands within minutes, and the whispers turned into questioning glances, those glances into outright shock painted across their faces. Hayes tried to regain control, really tried, flashing that smug, polished smile he'd perfected over decades of boardroom victories, but it faltered like a light bulb flickering before it dies, and his hand shaking slightly as he reached for his glass betrayed him worse than any confession could. The scotch inside rattled softly against the crystal, like a tiny alarm bell ringing in the silence. Bailey remained steady as a lighthouse in a storm, calm and focused and completely composed, and it was beautiful in a way that's hard to put into words if you think about it. Here was this 12-year-old girl, orphaned and underestimated by literally everyone in that room, standing in a space designed specifically to intimidate people, and yet she was the eye of the hurricane, perfectly still while chaos swirled around her. Every clause of her contract was like a brick in a fortress. Every signature was a shield she'd carefully crafted, and slowly, methodically, painfully, the room realized what we'd all been sensing deep down. This wasn't just some kid talking back. This was mastery. This was someone who'd done her homework and checked it twice and brought receipts for everything. Then came the cruel irony that made the whole thing almost poetic. Hayes had built his entire empire on intimidation and spectacle and making people afraid of him, and now all of it was crumbling quietly before the public eye while he stood there powerless to stop it. Security fidgeted near the walls, visibly uncomfortable and unsure what to do, while board members whispered frantically to each other with faces that looked genuinely shaken. Bailey's faint smile, just this slight curve of her lips, was almost playful, but it carried serious weight, not arrogance but precision, pure calculated assurance that she knew exactly what she was doing and where this was heading. And in that charged silence where you could practically taste the tension, you could sense the inevitable approaching like a train, Hayes's first real taste of consequence, not the sanitized corporate kind with fines and lawyers, but the raw public kind where your reputation gets shredded in real time. Don't click away now, you'll regret it. And just when you thought the tension couldn't possibly climb any higher, it did, because there's this moment, subtle but completely unforgettable, when someone in the room recognizes exactly what's happening, and it changes absolutely everything. That's what happened with Margaret Jensen, this senior board member who'd been quietly watching the entire evening unfold from her corner seat like she was studying a chess match she already knew the ending to. Her eyes widened slightly, barely perceptible really, just this tiny flicker that most people would miss. But in that instant the room shifted again like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface. Suddenly what had been a clash between ego and courage turned into something bigger, a reckoning being witnessed by someone who truly understood the stakes, someone whose opinion actually mattered in the world of corporate power. Hayes noticed her gaze too, way too late to do anything about it, and whatever confidence he'd been desperately clinging to like a life raft cracked just a little bit more. He straightened his tie with trembling fingers, tried to force that same smirk that used to command boardrooms and intimidate junior executives, but Margaret's recognition was like holding up a mirror to his face, and let me tell you, mirrors are absolutely brutal when they reflect not arrogance, but pure foolishness staring back at you. Bailey, ever so calm and collected, barely moved a muscle, but there was this subtle acknowledgement in her eyes, almost imperceptible unless you were really paying attention, that she'd been seen by exactly the right person at exactly the right time. You could feel it rippling through the space, that thrill of small victories piling up into something completely unstoppable, like dominoes starting to fall in perfect sequence. Because Margaret knew things, she understood the weight of that contract, the meticulous preparation behind it, the sheer courage it took to stand up in a room like this, and as someone who'd navigated corporate boards for decades, she recognized the significance immediately. This wasn't just a child asserting herself. This was a masterclass in strategic brilliance playing out live. Meanwhile, Hayes's attempts to regain control became increasingly frantic and desperate, his hands fidgeting with the crystal glass he'd somehow forgotten to put down, fingers drumming this nervous rhythm against the surface. You could almost hear his internal panic, the calculations racing through his mind, the second-guessing, the fear of losing control spiraling completely out of his carefully curated universe that he'd spent years building. And phones were still flashing everywhere, live stream numbers climbing steadily by the second, every eye and every whisper and every camera angle just compounding the pressure on him like weights stacking up on his chest. Here's the thing about recognition, though. It doesn't just validate the hero, it exposes the villain in ways that can't be undone. Margaret's silent acknowledgement acted like a ripple spreading through water. Colleagues who'd been hesitating before, unsure whether to intervene or look away or pick a side, now felt this moral imperative pressing down on them like gravity itself. They leaned in closer, they watched with more intensity, and Hayes finally realized with crystal clarity that he was being cornered in front of witnesses who would never let him off easy. The next 60 seconds will change everything you thought you knew. And then it happened, that precise moment when the murmurs in the room became a wave, spreading faster than anyone could have imagined, and you could feel it before you even heard it, that subtle shift in posture, that quick intake of breath, the collective awareness that something absolutely monumental was unfolding right in front of everyone's eyes. Christopher Hayes, the man who'd spent literal decades commanding respect and intimidating colleagues and charming investors with nothing but his presence, suddenly realized with soul-crushing clarity that he wasn't in control anymore, not here, not now, not ever again in this room. And oh man, you could see it written across his face like a bad script he had absolutely no way to rewrite, no emergency exit he could take. Bailey, holding the contract with this calm certainty that seemed almost supernatural for someone her age, watched silently as the board members began whispering among themselves in urgent, hushed tones. Here's the fascinating thing, though, and this is what people miss when they watch the clips later. It wasn't just about the legal language or the signatures or the notarized stamps. It was about presence, about preparation, about this 12-year-old kid having the audacity to stand up and say, I see you, I see what you've done, and I absolutely will not let you get away with this. And believe me, there's something deeply human about watching injustice being challenged in real time. It triggers something primal in all of us, that part that wants to see fairness, even when it seems impossible. One by one, the board members' expressions changed like dominoes falling in sequence. Some leaned forward, scanning the contract with widening eyes, nodding almost imperceptibly, like they were discovering something they'd suspected, but never confirmed. Others exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that says she's right, and he knows it without anyone having to speak a single word out loud. Margaret Jensen's eyes lingered on Hayes with this look that could have frozen water, and that look alone, oh, that look was enough to make anyone's confidence crumble into dust. You could almost hear the mental calculation running through Hayes's mind at light speed. How did I miss this? How could I have been so careless, so blind, so absolutely stupid? And while the CEO scrambled desperately to regain some kind of composure, trying to find words that would save him, Bailey remained perfectly composed, almost serene in her stillness. Every slight movement she made, every controlled breath she took, carried massive weight that filled the entire space. You could sense that she knew exactly how far she could push, how much patience she needed, and most importantly, when to let the moment speak for itself, without interference. Phones continued flashing like paparazzi at a premiere, live stream viewers climbing by the thousands every few seconds as the world paused to watch this unraveling of power happen in real time. Hayes tried to speak, tried to deflect with that charm that used to work like magic, but the words sounded hollow and desperate, echoing in the marble lobby like coins dropped in an empty well. The room was no longer his stage to command. It belonged to Bailey now, completely and utterly. Subscribe before the final blow lands. Right now, over 2 million people are watching this unfold, but only subscribers get notified when the next story drops, and trust me, if you think this one's intense, wait until you hear what happens when a homeless veteran discovers his former commander stole his entire pension. Subscribe before you forget, because you'll be searching for this channel later and wishing you'd done it now. The sound of the emergency alarm cut through the murmurs like a knife through butter, sharp and metallic, and so urgent it made everyone's heart skip a beat. At first it was just this faint wail in the distance, but in a room already vibrating with enough tension to power a small city, it felt like someone had just declared war. Every single head snapped toward the source of the sound, next turning in unison like some creepy synchronized dance, and Hayes froze mid-gesture with one hand still hovering over his glass, this cocktail of disbelief and pure panic flickering across his features like a neon sign. You could almost hear the tiny internal scream of his ego cracking under the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. Bailey didn't flinch, though, not even a little bit. She simply adjusted the contract in her hands with this small, deliberate movement that somehow made her presence feel even larger than before, like she was growing taller while everyone else shrank. The room seemed to literally shrink around her calm, like all the chaos and flashing cameras and 1,000 whispering observers were being funneled into this singular pivotal moment that nobody would ever forget. Security guards began moving swiftly across the marble floor, their polished shoes clicking in rhythm, eyes darting frantically between Hayes and the girl who had somehow quietly taken over the entire room without firing a single shot. And here's what makes this scene feel almost like a movie. It wasn't loud chaos with people screaming and running. It was controlled panic, the kind where everyone's terrified but trying desperately not to show it. The guards weren't charging in like action heroes. They were watching and waiting and processing, trying to figure out in real time whose side they were supposed to be on. Even Hayes's own assistants looked uncertain, glancing at each other and muttering under their breaths, attempting to calculate whether staying loyal to him was still the smart move or if jumping ship was the better option. The faint rustle of papers mixed with whispered phone alerts and the steady click-click-click of cameras recording everything created this soundtrack that felt more like a courtroom in motion than a charity gala, a moral battleground where every observer, whether in the room or watching on live stream, felt caught in the tension like flies in honey. Hayes tried desperately to regain control, attempting to laugh it off with a wave of his hand, trying to get people to calm down and look at him instead of the alarm, but it was painfully clear to everyone watching that the room no longer followed his lead. Authority had shifted completely, not with shouting or intimidation, but with preparation and courage and evidence meticulously documented in that single unassuming contract. Every heartbeat of the audience seemed to echo this silent realization washing over them like a wave. The boy, or in this case the girl, had him cornered legally and morally with no escape route in sight. Phones buzzed with notifications. Social media was probably exploding in real time. Livestream numbers kept ticking higher, reflecting the collective shock of a world watching a Titan's complete unraveling. What happens in the next chapter will leave you breathless. It's a peculiar thing, watching people suddenly realize where their loyalties actually lie, like watching a magic trick where the illusion breaks and you finally see how it all works. One moment, everyone's frozen in this polite fear, playing it safe and keeping their heads down, and the next moment allegiances start shifting like sand beneath your feet, unstable and unpredictable and completely fascinating to watch. That's exactly what happened in the lobby that night, and Hayes, trying desperately to salvage whatever dignity he had left, realized with horror that the room wasn't just observing anymore. They were judging him, and even worse, they were quietly aligning against him like pieces on a chessboard moving into position. You could almost feel the walls closing in on him, getting tighter with every passing second. Bailey, calm and collected as always, let the energy of the room do all the heavy lifting for her. She didn't have to shout or demand attention because it came to her naturally like gravity pulling objects down. Margaret Jensen, who'd already recognized the weight and courage of what Bailey was doing, leaned closer to a few senior board members, whispering urgently and pointing at the contract in this way that only the careful strategic observer could truly understand. And suddenly those whispers became nods, subtle acknowledgments of this uncomfortable truth nobody wanted to say out loud. Hayes had been exposed completely, and there was no amount of charming or blustering that could fix it now. The CEO, sensing the shift happening around him like the temperature dropping before a storm, attempted another laugh, faint and strained, trying one more time to reclaim some shred of control. But let's be honest here. When a room collectively starts leaning the other way, when people stop believing in you, laughter becomes hollow and almost tragic to witness. His tie had loosened somehow, sweat was creeping along his collar in visible beads, and those polished shoes that used to command so much attention were now shuffling nervously against the marble like a kid called to the principal's office. Every subtle gesture he made, every micro-expression that flashed across his face, betrayed the panic rising inside him like water filling a sinking ship. He'd built his entire empire on fear and spectacle, on making people afraid to challenge him, yet here he stood being completely humbled while a 12-year-old girl orchestrated the entire narrative with a calmness that would honestly make seasoned executives pause and take notes. Meanwhile, the contract itself, that crucial document sitting on the polished table, wasn't just paper anymore. It had become this symbol that felt almost alive in its quiet authority. Every clause, every notarized signature seemed to weigh heavier as board members whispered frantically to one another, their voices carrying just enough for everyone to catch fragments of what they were saying. Phones continued flashing without pause, the live viewer count climbing steadily by the second, turning what should have been a private gala into this global spectacle that millions were watching unfold. The moral clarity of the moment struck everyone like lightning. This wasn't about wealth or titles or fancy designer suits. It was about right and wrong, preparation versus arrogance, courage facing down corruption. You won't believe what she does next. The moment Hayes realized he wasn't just losing control in private, that this catastrophe was happening on the most public stage imaginable, you could literally see something break inside him. Phones were flashing like tiny, unrelenting spotlights, capturing every single nuance of his panic in high definition, and live stream viewers were climbing by the thousands every few seconds. You could almost hear their collective gasp echoing through the internet like a wave crashing against shore. Hayes had always thought power meant control, absolute, unquestionable control, but this nightmare unfolding around him was teaching a different brutal lesson. The room wasn't following him anymore. They were witnessing him unravel thread by thread. Bailey, holding the contract close to her chest like a shield, didn't move a single muscle, her calmness creating this stark contrast against Hayes's growing desperation that was honestly beautiful in a cinematic kind of way. The contrast itself became its own character in that room. The entitled CEO who'd spent decades believing he was untouchable versus this composed, underestimated 12-year-old who refused to bow or break or back down even slightly. People often underestimate the raw power of composure, and let me tell you, in a moment like this, it isn't just impressive to watch, it's absolutely devastating to anyone on the receiving end. Hayes flailed verbally, trying desperately to assert some kind of dominance, but every word that came out of his mouth sounded hollow and flat and almost comical in its desperation, like watching someone try to bail water out of a sinking ship with a teaspoon. And here's the thing about public humiliation that makes it so uniquely painful. It's not just the laughter or the whispers rippling through the crowd. It's this crushing realization that everyone everywhere is watching you fail, and there's absolutely no escape from it. Board members were leaning so far forward in their seats they looked like they might fall out. Cameras clicked in rapid succession, creating this soundtrack of judgment. Security guards shifted their weight uncomfortably from foot to foot, and the live stream kept ticking those numbers higher with every passing second until it reached figures that would make any content creator jealous. Hayes's scotch glass trembled visibly in his hand, a tiny reflection of an entire world tilting dangerously beneath his feet, and every dollar he'd ever flaunted suddenly felt completely meaningless against the crushing weight of total exposure. Meanwhile, Bailey's quiet, unwavering presence had become the true spectacle everyone couldn't stop watching. You could see people noticing all the subtle details now. The way she held herself with such dignity, that steady gaze that never wavered even for a second, the faint confident smile that said without words, I know exactly what I'm doing and where this is going. There was no shouting, no theatrical gestures, no dramatic proclamations. Just this undeniable command over the entire room that cut deeper than anger or rage could ever hope to. The whispers around them grew into actual murmurs of disbelief. People asking each other how could this girl, this child barely tall enough to see over the table, hold her ground against one of the most powerful men in the entire building. Hayes tried one last desperate attempt to assert control, but the room had shifted so completely and irreversibly that his words just dissolved into the air like smoke. Stay watching, the explosion is coming. The room held its breath as Bailey placed the contract on that polished marble table, and when she did it wasn't just paper hitting stone, it was a sound that seemed to echo through every corner of that grand lobby, bouncing off chandeliers and catching everyone's attention like a thunderclap in dead silence. There was something almost theatrical about it, even though nothing was rehearsed. It was just truth meeting arrogance head-on, and the reverberation was absolutely undeniable. Hayes flinched like someone had physically slapped him across the face, his features draining of color so fast he looked almost cartoonish, yet terrifyingly human at the same time. You know what's wild about watching moments like this unfold in real time? It makes you realize just how fragile power really is. Like all those years of dominance and boardroom deals and polished suits and carefully orchestrated schedules suddenly didn't mean a single thing against actual evidence and courage and meticulous preparation. Bailey, standing there, barely taller than some of the seated executives around her, became this gravitational center that everything else orbited around. And here's a funny thing about gravity. It doesn't care one bit about your wealth or your fame or your carefully constructed image. It just pulls the truth forward with relentless force, and boy did it pull hard that night. The board members leaned in even closer, whispering urgently to each other, and those whispers weren't loud, but the tension they created was absolutely deafening in its intensity. Margaret Jensen's eyes were practically glowing with this mixture of admiration and disbelief, while Hayes's assistants fidgeted helplessly near the walls, looking like they wanted to disappear into the marble itself. And the audience. Oh, the audience was something else entirely. Phones raised high in the air, live stream numbers climbing into figures that seemed impossible, and you could almost hear the clicks as the entire world outside that room followed along with the slow, methodical dismantling of a man who'd always believed he was completely untouchable. Hayes opened his mouth, trying desperately to speak, to say something that would save him, but the words got tangled in his throat like poorly written dialogue that nobody believed. His hand wavered toward the papers as if he could somehow snatch them back and erase all the damage they'd caused, but the room's focus was absolute and unbreakable now. Bailey's calmness stood in stark contrast to his obvious flailing, a masterclass in presence that some executives spend their entire careers trying to learn and never quite get right. She didn't need to shout or scream or make grand gestures, just one measured step, one deliberate movement, and the entire narrative had flipped completely on its head like a coin landing on the opposite side. The murmurs around them grew louder now, spreading through the crowd like wildfire you couldn't contain. People weren't just observing passively anymore, they were actively aligning themselves with what they were seeing. And in that precise instant, Hayes realized with soul-crushing clarity that he'd lost control not because he was weak or unprepared, but because he had fundamentally underestimated what courage looks like when it's backed by preparation. That contract wasn't just a legal document anymore, it was a hammer that had just slammed every single door shut on his arrogance. This is where everything changes forever. The moment felt almost unreal, like watching a slow-motion scene in a blockbuster movie, except this wasn't fiction. This was happening right now in real life. Phones were pointed everywhere you looked, fingers trembling as they tapped that Go Live button, and within literal seconds, Bailey's calm defiance had transformed into a global spectacle that nobody could look away from. Yes, global, I'm not exaggerating even a little bit. The live stream numbers ticked upward with this alarming speed that made your head spin. 10,000 viewers, then 50,000, then 200,000 in what felt like a single heartbeat. And it wasn't just curiosity driving people to watch, it was pure human indignation, that raw feeling we all get when we see injustice happening, and we want to see it corrected. People genuinely love watching justice unfold, especially when it's delivered with this quiet, meticulous precision, and here it was playing out in real time for millions to witness. Hayes, now fully aware that he'd lost not only the room but literally the world's attention, swiped frantically at his phone like sheer willpower alone could somehow erase all the evidence mounting against him. But let's be honest, we've all been there, right? That moment when you realize nothing you do, no amount of panic or charm or desperate scrambling, can undo what's happening directly in front of your eyes. He was completely flustered, his face displaying this mixture of disbelief and raw, unpracticed fear, a combination that can be strangely satisfying to witness when you know someone's arrogance has finally crashed into a wall they didn't see coming. Meanwhile, Bailey remained composed like a statue carved from marble. She didn't look at the cameras or gesture dramatically or try to explain herself. She simply stood there with the contract in hand, letting the truth speak for itself. And oh man, the power of truth, when it's allowed to just exist without interference. It's funny, isn't it? How truth doesn't need to scream or beg for attention, it just is, and in this case it demanded recognition from every single person present. Every person in that room felt the weight of it pressing down on them. The board members shifted nervously in their expensive chairs, whispers turning into these low murmurs of acknowledgement that spread like ripples in water. Security guards exchanged meaningful glances, realizing with growing certainty that they were witnessing something genuinely extraordinary, an ordinary 12-year-old girl dictating the flow of a room filled with some of the wealthiest, most powerful adults in the entire city. The reactions pouring in from outside were just as visceral and intense, comments flooding the live streams faster than anyone could read them. This is absolutely unbelievable. And I can't believe he thought he could intimidate her. And she's completely fearless, creating this digital chorus of collective awe mixed with righteous anger. And as the view count climbed past 500,000 with no signs of slowing down, Bailey's small, deliberate movements seemed magnified somehow, almost cinematic in their impact. Every subtle nod of her head, every faint tightening of her grip on that contract, told viewers around the world exactly who held the real power in that marble lobby. Don't miss the moment he finally breaks. Listen, I've spent months researching Bailey's story, tracking down court documents, interviewing witnesses, making sure you get the truth and not some watered-down version. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you why you believe in justice, then subscribe as a way of saying, keep bringing me these stories. We're building something here, and you're either in or you're out. The tension was almost physical at this point, like the air itself had been replaced with something thick and heavy that you could actually feel pressing against your skin. Hayes, who'd spent literal decades believing that money could bend reality to his will, now realized with this crushing, devastating clarity that reality had bent him instead, twisted him up, and exposed him completely. His face was pale as chalk, sweat collecting along his hairline in visible beads that caught the chandelier light, while the board members, people he'd always assumed were his loyal allies, stared back at him with this mixture of shock and dawning respect for the girl who'd just completely upended their entire world. Bailey stood there looking small but absolutely immovable, like she'd grown roots into that marble floor, the contract now fully visible with every signature and every clause painstakingly notarized for all to see. And let's pause here for just a second because this scene proves something really important. Size genuinely doesn't matter when it comes to power. You can be 12 years old and underestimated by literally everyone, but if you have preparation and courage and clarity on your side, the rules of the game change completely. Power doesn't live in how tall you are or how loud you speak. It lives in knowing exactly what you're doing and why. Hayes, for all his wealth and private jets and fancy cars and carefully curated image, was suddenly just a man holding an empty Scotch glass, confronted with a legal reality he never bothered to prepare for. Whispers began circulating through the room, spreading fast like wildfire through dry grass. She owns the company, someone said in disbelief. No, this can't be real, another person muttered. Where did she even get that contract? The murmurs and almost inaudible gasps were everyone's way of processing shock, because isn't that how humans work? We panic when our basic assumptions about the world suddenly crumble beneath us. Hayes's arrogance had assumed total compliance from everyone. Bailey's calm had demanded acknowledgement and respect, and the collision of these two forces, the old guard versus unexpected truth, was absolutely mesmerizing to watch unfold. Hayes tried desperately to recover some ground, attempting humor in a flailing way, even slipping a subtle thread into his words that everyone caught. "Do you really think this changes anything?" he stammered, but his voice cracked on the last word. The room had already shifted, though. The board members were no longer seeing him as this untouchable figure. They were seeing him as exposed and vulnerable and embarrassingly human in all the worst ways. Meanwhile, Bailey's quiet determination had become the new heartbeat of that entire space, steady and relentless, and impossible to ignore. One by one, people started stepping forward, not to defend her because honestly she didn't need defending, but to acknowledge her authority in ways that made Hayes's face go even paler. Margaret Jensen, the senior board member everyone respected, adjusted her glasses carefully, nodded slightly with this look of finality, and said in a voice that carried through the silence, "It appears, Mr. Hayes, the contract speaks for itself." Every single person felt it in that moment. The walls themselves seemed to shift and change. Power had moved from one person to another not through force, but through courage and precision and undeniable moral clarity. "You need to see what happens next." Hayes's hands trembled as he stared at the growing sea of smartphones and cameras all pointed directly at him like spotlights on a stage he never wanted to be on. It was the kind of moment that makes you realize in a very personal, gut-wrenching way that arrogance can only carry you so far before it becomes your downfall. And trust me, you could almost see it physically weighing on him, like gravity had suddenly decided to become a punishment specifically designed for his crimes. He tried to speak, this shaky, uneven attempt to reclaim even a tiny shred of control. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he stammered, his voice cracking on every other word. But oh, everyone understood perfectly, probably better than he ever had in his entire privileged life. The stakes weren't just about dollars or stock prices or quarterly earnings. They were about dignity and justice and accountability, and in that lobby, every single eye was locked on a 12-year-old girl who had more of those qualities than Hayes could ever hope to muster. Bailey didn't flinch even slightly. She shifted her weight just a little bit, adjusting the contract one more time, as if making absolutely sure that every clause and every notarized signature gleamed perfectly under those bright chandelier lights. There was this strange elegance in her stillness, a quiet intensity that made you realize with sudden clarity that yes, courage is often completely silent. It doesn't need fanfare or theatrics. Hayes lunged forward in one last desperate grab for the papers, his movements almost comical really, like watching a cartoon villain flail around, except this was painfully real life and the humiliation happening wasn't staged for entertainment. Phones captured every single second in high definition, live stream numbers climbing exponentially higher, the entire world watching a titan of industry unravel in the most public way imaginable. And then came the twist that absolutely nobody saw coming. The moment that reset everything, Margaret Jensen stepped forward with this firm, deliberate movement, placing her hand on Hayes's shoulder with enough pressure to stop him mid-reach. "Enough," she said, and that single word carried more authority than any speech could. "This ends now, Christopher. You've had your moment to speak, but the company and the people and frankly basic human decency demand a complete reset." The words hit him harder than any financial loss ever could. You could see it in his eyes. It wasn't just authority speaking to him, it was moral clarity itself, a reminder that even the most untouchable figures are ultimately accountable to something bigger than themselves. Hayes's face turned from red to white in seconds flat, this storm of panic and disbelief washing over his features like a wave. His empire of control, so meticulously constructed over literal decades of manipulation and intimidation, was crumbling right in front of him, dismantled not by lawyers or scandals or investigations, but by meticulous preparation and courage and sheer unshakable integrity. And as he looked around that room, realizing that every bystander and every board member and every live stream viewer had witnessed his complete unraveling. You could almost hear the silence pressing against him like a physical weight, suffocating and inescapable, the kind that no amount of wealth could ever alleviate. The final confrontation is about to explode. Bailey finally spoke, and when she did, the entire room seemed to stop breathing all at once. Her voice was calm and composed, carrying this authority that went way beyond her years. "Mr. Hayes, the contract is clear. The decisions have been made. It's time to step aside." The words were simple, direct, no fancy legal jargon or complicated explanations, and yet they carried the kind of force that could move mountains or at least topple one very overinflated ego. It was one of those moments where simplicity becomes the most powerful weapon you have, where saying exactly what needs to be said without decoration or hesitation cuts deeper than any elaborate speech ever could. Hayes stood there completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying desperately to form words that would save him but finding absolutely nothing. You could see the exact moment when it truly hit him, when the full weight of what was happening crashed down on his shoulders like a building collapsing. His knees actually buckled slightly, and he had to grab the edge of the table to steady himself. The cameras caught everything in brutal high definition, every microexpression of defeat, every tremor of his hands, every bead of sweat rolling down his temple. By the time the lobby doors finally closed behind Hayes minutes later, the air felt different. Electric in a way that made your skin tingle. You could almost feel it vibrating against those marble floors, this combination of disbelief and relief and, yes, a little bit of satisfaction that justice had finally shown up fashionably late, but still made an entrance. The entire ordeal that had begun with nothing but a flippant insult and a sneer, and the kind of arrogance that makes your teeth ache just from witnessing it, had escalated into something that absolutely no one in that room would ever forget. And let's be real here, we all know what it feels like to watch someone get away with cruelty for way too long, to see them abuse their power and hurt people and face zero consequences. So when the tables finally turn, it hits different. Phones were still clicking away without pause. Live stream numbers had skyrocketed into territory that marketing executives dream about, and social media was probably exploding in real time before the ink on that contract was even fully dry. "She's 12. One tweet read that would get shared thousands of times. "She just owned a billionaire in front of the whole world." Another one exclaimed with multiple fire emojis. That moment, oh, that precise moment, was when the story became way more than just a lobby drama. It transformed into a cultural event that people would reference for years. It wasn't simply a girl versus a powerful man anymore. It was every underestimated person everywhere suddenly realizing that courage really could bend the rules that protected the so-called untouchable. Back inside the building, Margaret Jensen and the other board members exchanged meaningful glances, this unspoken understanding passing between them like electricity through a wire. They were witnesses to history, yes, absolutely, but they were also active participants in something that would define their legacy. And Bailey, standing quietly in that hallway afterward, brushed a strand of hair from her face with this simple gesture that somehow felt monumental. Subscribe now, or miss the stunning conclusion. By the time Hayes slumped into the plush leather of his office chair hours later, realizing for the first time in literal decades that wealth couldn't save him from exposure, the headlines were already everywhere, spreading across the internet like wildfire that nobody could contain. The words stung worse than any financial loss he'd ever experienced because they carried something money couldn't buy back, the verdict of public opinion, and once that verdict is out there in the world, it becomes a weight that even the richest person alive can't just shrug off. "Billionaire publicly humiliated by 12-year-old owner," read one headline that got shared millions of times. "Board confirms contract. Girl holds majority stake," declared another with a photo of Bailey looking impossibly calm. "Arrogance meets justice in grand lobby showdown," screamed a third that captured the moment perfectly. The story didn't end with Hayes' humiliation, though. That would have been too simple and honestly not nearly satisfying enough. It ended with responsibility and legacy, and a world that suddenly couldn't stop paying attention to a 12-year-old girl who'd refused to be ignored or pushed aside or treated like she didn't matter. Bailey stood quietly in the hallway after everything settled down. not thinking about the cameras or the headlines or the viral clips being shared across every social media platform imaginable, but about the actual work that lay ahead of her now. She'd won the moment. Yes, absolutely. Scored a victory that most people only dream about. But she'd also sparked something way bigger. A movement, really. A reminder to everyone watching that preparation and courage and moral clarity could genuinely dismantle even the most fortified egos, no matter how much money protected them. Meanwhile, back in boardrooms across the city, executives were having uncomfortable conversations about accountability, about the systems that had protected people like Hayes for far too long, about how a child had seen what they'd all chosen to ignore. You could feel it in corporate America, this shift happening, subtle but undeniable, like the first crack in a dam that's been holding back pressure for years. The live stream had been watched by over 2 million people by midnight, the clips shared and reshared until they'd reached every corner of the internet. Comment sections filled with people sharing their own stories of being underestimated, of facing down bullies in suits, of finding courage when everything seemed hopeless. This gave me chills. One comment read, "If she can do it, maybe I can too," wrote another person who'd been dealing with their own workplace nightmare. Bailey had become more than just a viral sensation. She'd become a symbol of something people desperately needed to believe in, proof that the system could be challenged, that David really could beat Goliath when David showed up prepared. But here's what made it all truly matter. Bailey didn't let any of it go to her head. She understood with wisdom beyond her years that this wasn't about fame or attention. It was about using power responsibly to make actual change. The final chapter will leave you speechless. The courtroom was silent in that heavy way that presses against your chest and makes every single heartbeat feel louder than it should, like the whole world was holding its breath waiting for what came next. People leaned forward in their seats, phones tucked discreetly in laps, even though everyone knew recordings were happening. Reporters scribbling furiously, trying to capture every word for history. And right there in the middle of it all was Bailey, no longer just a 12-year-old girl, no longer merely the daughter of a maid trying to be seen. She had become something bigger, the living embodiment of courage and preparation and integrity wrapped up in a person who refused to back down. The weight of the moment didn't escape her. You could see it in the way she carried herself, but somehow she handled it with a poise that was honestly cinematic. Hayes, on the other hand, was a complete shadow of the man he'd been in that marble lobby weeks earlier. His gold cufflinks still glinted faintly under the harsh courtroom lights in this feeble attempt to maintain an image, but everyone could see through it now. The arrogance had vanished completely, replaced by the stark realization that the world had finally caught up with him. And let's be honest here. There is something deeply satisfying about watching someone who built an empire on entitlement and cruelty finally get confronted by truth they can't buy their way out of. The judge's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Christopher Hayes is hereby removed from his position, and restitution will be pursued in full. Furthermore, the ownership of the company remains with Bailey Grant, whose actions exemplify diligence, ethical responsibility, and genuine foresight. Every word landed like a drumbeat echoing through that room, and you could almost hear the collective exhale of everyone present. There were subtle cheers, knowing nods, and of course the constant click-click of phones capturing this moment for posterity. This was the kind of justice that didn't just feel good in the moment. It resonated deep, it taught lessons, it inspired people watching from their homes to believe change was actually possible. After the verdict, Bailey stepped up to address the room, her voice calm and almost tender, yet carrying this authority that seemed impossible for someone her age. She spoke about responsibility, about fairness, about using power wisely, not to dominate others, but to lift them up instead. She reminded everyone that courage means absolutely nothing without action, and that even the smallest voices can demand accountability when they prepare properly and speak with unwavering integrity. And for those of us watching, whether in that courtroom or on screens around the world, her words were way more than just a speech. They were a mirror held up to society. Reminder that the difference between staying silent and taking a stand could literally change not just one life, but an entire broken system. As people filed out and the media buzzed with headlines that would follow her forever, Bailey didn't pause to read any of them. She had real work waiting, initiatives for transparency and employee welfare and community programs that mattered more than viral fame ever could. The story didn't end with Hayes' downfall or the headlines. It ended with responsibility and legacy and undeniable proof that preparation, courage, and ethical clarity could against all odds genuinely change the world. It was more than victory. It was a lesson for anyone who'd ever been underestimated. Sometimes the smallest hand holds the heaviest power, and the quietest voice moves mountains. Bailey's story proves something we all need to remember. Preparation beats privilege every single time. But here's what most people don't know. 3 months after this courtroom victory, Hayes tried to destroy her using a loophole nobody saw coming, and what Bailey did next made international headlines for completely different reasons. That story's already waiting for subscribers. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because I promise you, the next chapter of Bailey's journey will make this look like the opening act. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.